the Voynich Manuscript. In 1912, inside the old Jesuit library of Villa Mondragone near Rome, a rare book dealer named Wilfrid Voynich opened a manuscript that should have belonged to some known world of language, science, or religion. It did not. The pages were made of aged vellum, filled from margin to margin with flowing symbols no scholar could read. Strange plants curled across the parchment. Naked human figures stood inside green pools and tubes. Stars, circles, moons, and impossible botanical diagrams appeared beside words written in a script that looked organized, deliberate, and completely unknown. Voynich had handled medieval books before. He knew the feel of fraud, decoration, and ritual copying. But this object did not feel like a joke. It felt like a system whose key had vanished. The manuscript, now known as the Voynich Manuscript, contains more than 200 surviving pages. Scientific testing has placed the parchment in the early 15th century, making it old enough to belong to the late medieval world, yet strange enough to appear outside it. Its ink, layout, and binding suggest careful production, not a random fantasy assembled overnight. The text runs in smooth lines from left to right. Words repeat with patterns. Certain symbols appear more often in specific sections. Statistical studies have shown that the writing behaves in some ways like language, with structure, rhythm, and internal rules. Yet no known alphabet, cipher, shorthand system, or natural language has ever been proven to match it. The illustrations deepen the problem. The botanical section shows plants that resemble real herbs only in fragments, a root from one species, a leaf from another, a flower that seems invented. The astronomical pages contain circular diagrams, zodiac-like figures, stars connected to female forms, and celestial patterns that resist simple classification. The so-called biological section is even stranger, showing women immersed in green liquid, connected by pipes, pools, and organic-looking channels. Some researchers see medieval medicine, others see alchemy, some see cosmology. Others believe the images may record a lost system of knowledge that combined the body, the heavens, and the natural world into one map. For more than a century, the manuscript attracted some of the strongest minds in cryptology. Military codebreakers, linguists, medievalists, mathematicians, computer scientists, and artificial intelligence researchers all tried to break it. William and Elizabeth Friedman, two of the most respected cryptologists of the 20th century, studied the manuscript and still found no final answer. Modern algorithms have searched for hidden language families, substitution systems, abbreviations, and statistical traps. The result has always been the same. Patterns appear, hope rises, then the theory collapses. The reaction from the academic world has never been simple. Some scholars argue the book is a sophisticated hoax, created to impress a wealthy buyer or imitate forbidden knowledge. Others reject that explanation, pointing out that the manuscript's internal consistency would require an extraordinary amount of planning for no obvious reward. Some propose that it encodes a lost language. Others suggested a private scientific shorthand. A few believed it was never meant to be decoded by outsiders at all, not because a government sealed it away, but because the manuscript itself acts like a sealed room. It allows inspection. It allows photography. It allows measurement, but it refuses understanding. That refusal is what makes the Voynich manuscript so unsettling. It is not hidden in a cave or buried under ruins. It sits in a modern library, catalogued, scanned, studied, and still unread. The mystery survives not because no one has looked closely, but because thousands have looked closely and failed. If it is a hoax, it may be one of the most elaborate intellectual traps ever created. If it is a cipher, the key has outlived every school, monastery, and owner that might have explained it. And if it is a real book of knowledge, then something once known to human beings has slipped so completely from memory that even the shape of its words no longer belongs to us. The most disturbing possibility is not that the Voynich manuscript is meaningless. The most disturbing possibility is that it means exactly what it says, and humanity has simply forgotten how to listen. The Rohonc Codex. In 1838, inside the library collection of the Hungarian Academy of Sciences, a small manuscript arrived from the estate of Count Gustav Batthyány. At first glance, it did not look powerful. It was not massive like a cathedral Bible. It was not sealed in gold. It measured only about 4.7 inches by 3.9 inches, the size of an object made to be held close to the body, rather than displayed before a crowd. But when scholars opened its pages, they found something that did not fit neatly into any known archive. Line after line of unknown symbols filled the manuscript. Between them were hundreds of crude but strangely deliberate illustrations, showing soldiers, crosses, crescents, buildings, battles, ceremonies, and figures arranged in scenes that looked religious, historical, and coded at the same time. The book was not silent. It was speaking in a script nobody could prove they understood. The manuscript became known as the Rohonc Codex, named after the town of Rohonc, now Rechnitz in Austria, where it had reportedly been kept before entering scholarly custody. Its pages appeared handmade. Its images looked simple, almost childlike at first, but the repetition of symbols suggested more than decoration. The writing was dense, controlled, and unusually consistent. Some researchers believed it ran from right to left. Others disagreed. The symbols did not match Latin, Greek, Hebrew, Cyrillic, Arabic, Glagolitic, or any standard medieval script. There were too many signs for an alphabet, too many patterns for random marks, and too much internal order for an easy dismissal. What makes the Rohonc Codex so unnerving is the way the text and images seem to pull against each other. The illustrations appear familiar enough to tempt interpretation. A crucifixion scene seems to point toward Christianity. Crescent shapes suggest Islamic influence. Military figures suggest war, invasion, or sacred conflict. Some panels seem to show kings, priests, cities, and processions. But the writing refuses to confirm any of it. The pictures offer doors. The symbols remove the handles. Every time a scholar believes the manuscript belongs to one culture, another image pulls it elsewhere. The theories multiplied. Some argued the Codex was a religious text from a forgotten Christian sect. Others suggested it preserved a lost Balkan or Hungarian script. A few proposed that the manuscript encoded a language from the borderlands, where Catholic, Orthodox, and Ottoman worlds collided. Then came the harsher explanation: fraud. Several Hungarian scholars suspected that it could be an 18th or 19th century hoax, possibly designed to imitate antiquity and deceive collectors. The problem is that even the hoax theory does not end the mystery. A simple fake usually reveals its weakness under pressure. The Rohonc Codex does not collapse easily. Its symbol system remains regular. Its illustrations follow recurring themes. Its structure feels planned. Because of this uncertainty, the Codex was pushed into a strange academic limbo. It was not fully embraced as a lost scripture. It was not completely discarded as nonsense. It survived in the margins, copied, debated, scanned, and re-examined, yet never absorbed into a stable historical category. No government agents needed to remove it from public view. The deeper concealment was quieter than that. Once a manuscript is labeled too suspicious, too obscure, or too dangerous to a clean timeline, it can disappear without being locked away. It simply becomes a footnote. Scholars stop building careers on it. Institutions stop treating it as urgent. The mystery remains visible, but untouched. And that may be the most effective kind of burial. The Rohonc Codex does not need to vanish from a shelf to remain unread. It only needs the world to agree that unreadable means unimportant. Yet the pages still wait, filled with battles no one can date, prayers no one can pronounce, and symbols that may belong to no known alphabet because they belong to a vanished method of thought. If the manuscript is a hoax, then someone created one of Europe's most persistent false languages with extraordinary discipline. If it is real, then an entire voice from the past is trapped behind signs we have forgotten how to follow. The question is not only what the Rohonc Codex says. The colder question is why, after nearly 2 centuries of staring at its pages, humanity still cannot decide whether it is looking at a lie, a lost scripture, or the last surviving book of a world that no longer has a name. The Book of Soyga. In 1552, in the shadowed intellectual world of Tudor England, a young scholar named John Dee began building one of the most unusual private libraries in Europe. Dee was not merely a collector of books. He was a mathematician, astronomer, astrologer, navigator, and later an advisor to Queen Elizabeth I. His shelves held works of geometry, optics, medicine, theology, cryptography, and forbidden magic. But among them was one manuscript that seemed to trouble him more than the rest. Its title was strange, almost backward in sound: Soyga. The Book of Soyga did not behave like an ordinary text. It contained magic squares, coded tables, planetary invocations, angelic language, and a structure so difficult that Dee believed no human scholar could fully unlock it alone. The manuscript, known in Latin as Alderia Sive Soyga Vocor, was a dense occult treatise filled with rituals, astrological correspondences, demonological names, and mathematical tables. To the casual reader, it may have looked like a medieval manual of ceremonial magic. To Dee, it appeared to be something more precise. The text seemed to combine language, number, and cosmic order into a single system. Its most famous section contained 36 large tables, each arranged in a square of letters. These were not decorative alphabets. They were carefully organized grids, filled with repeated patterns and apparent encryption. The letters seemed to hide names, formulas, or commands inside their structure, as if the manuscript had been built like a locked machine made of words. Dee had spent much of his life searching for a universal language, a divine mathematics behind creation itself. The Book of Soyga fit that obsession too perfectly. It did not simply discuss magic. It suggested that reality might be readable through symbolic arrangement. Planets, angels, numbers, names, and human actions were placed into relation with one another, implying that the universe was not chaos, but a vast coded text. The problem was that Dee could not solve it. The manuscript gave him pieces, but not the method. It offered signs, but not the final grammar. In 1583, during one of Dee's famous angelic conversations with the medium Edward Kelly, Dee asked about the Book of Soyga. The answer he recorded was unsettling. The book, he was told, had been revealed to Adam in paradise, and only the Archangel Michael could interpret its deepest meaning. Whether Dee believed this literally, symbolically, or through the emotional force of the ritual is still debated. But the effect was clear. Soyga became more than a book in his library. It became a challenge placed beyond ordinary scholarship, a manuscript that might contain knowledge, but knowledge guarded by something higher than human reason. After Dee's death, the Book of Soyga disappeared. For centuries, scholars knew of it mostly through references in Dee's diaries and catalogs. The manuscript became a ghost text, famous because it was missing, and dangerous because no one could confirm exactly what Dee had seen. Then, in the 20th century, copies were identified in British library collections, hiding in plain sight under catalog titles few had connected to Dee's lost book. Its return should have solved the mystery. Instead, it deepened it. The manuscript could finally be studied, but the tables remained resistant. Modern researchers decoded parts of the construction method, yet the full intention of the text has never been settled. There was no dramatic seizure, no burned archive, no forbidden vault. The concealment of Soyga was quieter and more disturbing. It vanished through miscataloguing, neglect, and the collapse of the intellectual world that once knew how to ask the right questions. That kind of disappearance may be even more permanent than destruction. A book can survive physically, while its meaning dies around it. If the Book of Soyga is merely an occult compilation, it remains one of the strangest examples of Renaissance magical thought. But if Dee was right to fear that its tables concealed a deeper system, then the manuscript may be a remnant of an older idea. That knowledge was not always written to explain the world, but to operate within it. Perhaps Soyga was not meant to be read like a book. Perhaps it was meant to be activated like a key. And if the final lock still has not opened, then the question remains as cold as the parchment itself. What did John Dee almost understand? And why did he believe only an angel could finish the reading? The Codex Gigas. In the early 13th century, inside a Benedictine monastery in Bohemia, a book was created so large that it seemed less like a manuscript and more like a monument built from skin, ink, and fear. Later generations would call it the Codex Gigas, the giant book. It stood nearly 3 feet tall, almost 20 inches wide, and weighed around 165 pounds. 2 people were needed to lift it safely. Its pages were made from animal skin. Its text was written in Latin with extraordinary consistency. But the detail that transformed it from a medieval treasure into an object of dread was not its size. It was the full-page portrait of the devil staring out from the parchment, alone, crouched, clawed, and trapped inside the book like a prisoner who had been given a throne. The Codex Gigas is often called the Devil's Bible, but that name can mislead. Much of the manuscript is not satanic at all. It contains the Latin Bible, historical works, medical texts, a chronicle of Bohemia, a calendar, lists of monks, and formulas of confession and exorcism. In one sense, it was an encyclopedia of medieval knowledge, a library compressed into a single object. Yet the arrangement is strange. Sacred scripture sits beside practical medicine. History sits beside rituals against evil. The portrait of the devil appears opposite an image of the heavenly city, creating a visual confrontation between damnation and salvation. The book does not simply record belief, it stages a battle. The legend attached to its creation is even darker. According to later tradition, the manuscript was made by a monk who broke his vows and was sentenced to be walled up alive. To escape death, he promised to create in one night a book containing all human knowledge, a book that would glorify the monastery forever. As midnight approached and the task proved impossible, he called upon the devil for help. The devil completed the manuscript, and in gratitude, the monk painted the demon's image inside. Historians treat this as legend, not fact. But the story survived because the physical manuscript makes the impossible feel almost reasonable. Its scale is so extreme that ordinary explanation feels too small. Scholars have studied the handwriting and found something deeply unusual. The text appears remarkably uniform across hundreds of pages, suggesting it may have been written by a single scribe or by scribes trained to match one hand with exceptional discipline. If one person produced it, the work may have taken 20 years or more. That possibility is almost more haunting than the legend. Not a single night of demonic assistance, but decades of isolation, repetition, and devotion. A human life poured into one enormous book, line by line, until the book became larger than the person who made it. Its later history only sharpened the mystery. The Codex Gigas eventually moved through royal and monastic collections before being taken to Sweden in 1648 after the 30 Years' War. It remains preserved today in the National Library of Sweden, but time has not left it whole. Several pages are missing, and no one can say with certainty what they contained. Because of its fragility and size, direct access is tightly controlled. Most people encounter it only through reproductions, photographs, and the famous devil image separated from the rest of the manuscript's intellectual architecture. The Codex Gigas is not unreadable like the Voynich Manuscript. Its Latin can be studied, its materials can be measured, its historical path can be traced. Yet the central question remains unresolved. Why would one medieval community invest so much labor into a single impossible book? Why place the devil so prominently inside a manuscript filled with scripture and knowledge? Was the portrait a warning, a confession, a theological lesson, or the shadow of something the missing pages once explained? If the Codex Gigas was meant to contain the total knowledge of its world, then the devil inside may not be an intrusion. It may be part of the message, a reminder that knowledge and danger were never far apart. And perhaps that is why the book still feels alive. Not because it proves a legend, but because it shows what happens when faith, fear, medicine, history, and forbidden imagination are bound together so tightly that even 8 centuries later, no one can fully separate them. The Ripley Scrolls. In the 15th century, somewhere within the closed world of English alchemy, a set of strange illustrated scrolls began to circulate among scholars who believed matter could be purified, transformed, and perhaps perfected. They were not ordinary books. They were long painted manuscripts, sometimes stretching more than 15 feet when unrolled, filled with dragons, crowned figures, furnaces, glass vessels, moons, suns, birds, blood-colored streams, and human bodies arranged like parts of a hidden machine. Later, they became known as the Ripley Scrolls, named after George Ripley, an English canon and alchemist whose writings became central to the search for the philosopher's stone. But the scrolls were never simple instructions. They looked less like recipes and more like maps of a process no one could safely describe in plain language. The surviving Ripley Scrolls are not all identical. Different copies exist in different collections, with variations in color, wording, imagery, and sequence. Some are lavishly painted, others are more restrained. yet they share a recurring symbolic architecture. At the top, a figure often stands beside a flask or vessel. Below, serpents coil. A red and white dragon appear in conflict. A green lion devours the sun. A bird rises from death. A crowned king and queen merge, dissolve, and reappear. Liquids flow downward through vessels as if the entire scroll is a vertical laboratory, showing transformation step by step from the heavens to the earth. To a modern viewer, the images can seem bizarre, even irrational, but to an alchemist, they formed a language. The green lion may have represented a corrosive substance capable of dissolving gold. The red and white figures may have pointed to sulfur and mercury, or masculine and feminine principles, or stages of purification. The king's death and rebirth may have described chemical change, spiritual initiation, or both at once. That is the core difficulty. The Ripley Scrolls do not separate chemistry from mysticism. They treat the laboratory, the body, the soul, and the cosmos as reflections of one hidden process. This makes full interpretation almost impossible. If the scrolls are read only as chemistry, too much symbolism remains unexplained. If they are read only as spiritual allegory, the furnaces, vessels, and substances become too specific to ignore. The same image may describe a real operation in a furnace, a meditation on death, and a coded warning about dangerous materials. The scrolls were designed in a world where knowledge was often protected by obscurity. To write too clearly about alchemy could invite ridicule, theft, or accusation. To write symbolically allowed the initiated to recognize meaning, while outsiders saw only madness. There was no single dramatic moment when the Ripley Scrolls were seized or banned. Their concealment was built into their design. They hid in plain sight behind beauty. Patrons collected them, scholars copied them, libraries preserved them. Yet even when displayed openly, they remained closed to understanding. The symbols acted like locks, and each generation produced new keys that never quite opened the whole mechanism. Some researchers believe the scrolls preserve genuine experimental knowledge from late medieval alchemy. Others argue they are devotional diagrams, visual poems about perfection, death, and divine order. Neither explanation fully consumes the other. That unresolved tension gives the Ripley Scrolls their power. They are books that behave like machines, images that pretend to be art while pointing toward procedure, manuscripts that promise transformation without ever stating exactly what must be transformed. If the alchemists who made them were chasing fantasy, then the scrolls record one of history's most elaborate symbolic dreams. But if they encoded real laboratory knowledge, then their failure to be fully understood means a practical tradition may have vanished behind its own secrecy. Perhaps the philosopher's stone was never a single object. Perhaps it was a process, a discipline, a dangerous knowledge hidden under dragons and kings because ordinary language was too exposed. And perhaps the Ripley Scrolls still contain the instructions, not lost, not destroyed, but waiting for someone who can read symbols the way alchemists once read fire. The Liber Linteus. In 1848, an Austrian-Croatian official named Mihajlo Baric returned from Egypt with an ancient mummy he had purchased as a curiosity. To him, the object was a relic from the land of pharaohs, wrapped in darkened linen and carrying the silence of a civilization already famous for death, ritual, and preservation. For years, the mummy remained more spectacle than mystery. It was displayed, moved, examined, and eventually donated to what is now the Archaeological Museum in Zagreb. But the true anomaly was not the body, it was the cloth around the body. When scholars began to study the linen strips more carefully, they noticed rows of writing running across the fabric. The symbols were not Egyptian, they were Etruscan. The discovery should not have been possible in any ordinary sense. The mummy came from Egypt, but the text belonged to a civilization that had flourished in ancient Italy across the Mediterranean Sea. The linen wrappings, later known as the Liber Linteus, or linen book, turned out to contain the longest known Etruscan text ever discovered. Nearly 12 feet of preserved writing survived across the bandages, divided into columns and filled with repeated ritual phrases, dates, divine names, and instructions. A book from one vanished culture had survived only because it had been cut apart and wrapped around the dead of another. That accident is what makes the Liber Linteus feel almost impossible. Etruscan books once existed, but nearly all disappeared. Their civilization influenced Rome profoundly, yet their language remains only partially understood. Most surviving Etruscan texts are short inscriptions on tombs, mirrors, urns, or votive objects. A few names, a few dedications, a few ritual phrases. The Liber Linteus is different. It is not a fragment carved on stone. It is a real book written on linen, carrying structured content across multiple sections. It suggests that Etruscan religious life was far more textually organized than the ruins alone reveal. The text appears to be a ritual calendar or liturgical manual. Certain repeated words seem to refer to offerings, ceremonies, months, and gods. Scholars have identified patterns that may correspond to dates and sacred obligations, yet the full meaning remains uncertain. The Etruscan language can be sounded out in many places because its letters are related to Greek alphabets, but sounding out a language is not the same as understanding it. The words can be seen, their grammar can be studied, their rhythm can be measured, but much of the message remains locked behind a dead cultural memory. The physical survival of the book is just as strange as the language. Linen decays, books are burned, reused, eaten by moisture, or destroyed by neglect. But this manuscript traveled from Italy to Egypt, was cut into strips, wrapped around a mummy, sealed in burial conditions, removed thousands of years later, sold as a curiosity, and finally recognized as one of the most important Etruscan texts in existence. It survived because someone destroyed it as a book. It endured because its original purpose was erased. There was no modern conspiracy needed to hide the Liber Linteus. Time performed the concealment with greater precision than any institution. The Etruscans vanished into Rome. Their books vanished into ash and rot. Their rituals vanished with the priests who performed them. Then the one long text that survived arrived disguised as Egyptian funerary material. For decades, its importance waited under the assumption that a mummy wrapping was only a mummy wrapping. That is the deeper unease of the Liber Linteus. It proves that lost books may still exist in altered forms, misidentified, repurposed, or hidden inside objects scholars think they already understand. What other texts were recycled into bindings, burial cloths, wall stuffing, or religious scraps? What other civilizations left their libraries not on shelves, but in fragments wrapped around the dead? If the Liber Linteus is a ritual manual, then it preserves instructions for ceremonies whose meaning has almost vanished. If it is something more, then its survival may be a warning that history does not always lose knowledge completely. Sometimes it hides knowledge inside the wrong object, in the wrong country, under the wrong name, waiting for someone to notice that the dead are carrying a book. The Copper Scroll. In 1952, in Cave 3 near Qumran, close to the northwest shore of the Dead Sea, archaeologists uncovered a scroll unlike any other manuscript found in the region. The Dead Sea Scrolls had already stunned the world with ancient biblical texts, sectarian writings, hymns, rules, and commentaries preserved for nearly 2,000 years. Most were written on parchment or papyrus, fragile materials that had survived only because the desert air was dry and unforgiving. But this object was different. It was not soft. It could not be unrolled by hand. It was made of copper, corroded, brittle, and rolled so tightly that opening it without destroying it was impossible. The object became known as the Copper Scroll. At first, researchers assumed it might contain another religious text. The setting encouraged that expectation. The caves around Qumran were linked to a Jewish community living during the late Second Temple period, and many of the scrolls carried theological, legal, or apocalyptic meaning. But when the Copper Scroll was finally cut open in thin sections in Manchester, in the 1950s, the text revealed something far stranger. It was not a prayer. It was not scripture. It was a list. The scroll described hidden deposits of gold, silver, ritual vessels, coins, and precious objects buried or concealed across dozens of locations. The language was direct, almost administrative. It gave measurements, landmarks, distances, and containers. One entry referred to silver hidden under steps. Another described treasure buried in a cistern. Others mentioned caves, tombs, channels, courtyards, and underground passages. The total quantity, if taken literally, would amount to an enormous fortune, weighing many tons. This was not written like myth. It read like an inventory created by someone who expected the treasure to be recovered. That is where the mystery becomes dangerous. Why would such a list be engraved into copper rather than written on parchment? Copper was expensive and difficult to inscribe. A document made from metal suggests durability, urgency, and importance. Whoever made the scroll seemed to believe the information had to survive conditions that ordinary writing might not endure. It was a message built not for everyday reading, but for preservation through catastrophe. Many scholars have tried to identify the treasure. Some believe it may refer to wealth removed from the Jerusalem temple before or during the Roman destruction in 70 CE. Others argue it belonged to the Qumran community itself. Some think the numbers are symbolic, exaggerated, or connected to ritual imagination rather than physical deposits. But the text does not behave like allegory in any simple way. Its locations are too specific. Its tone is too practical. It does not praise the treasure. It does not explain its spiritual purpose. It simply records where it is supposed to be. The search for the listed deposits has never produced a confirmed discovery matching the scroll's claims. Excavations, surveys, and private expeditions have followed its clues, but the landscape has changed across 2,000 years. Place names vanished. Buildings collapsed, water systems shifted, tombs were looted. The Roman war, later conflicts, erosion, and human settlement may have erased the original markers. Some locations may have been deliberately obscured. Others may have referred to places known only to a small inner circle. Officially, the Copper Scroll remains a historical puzzle, not a treasure map proven true. Yet its existence continues to trouble researchers because it stands apart from the other Dead Sea Scrolls. It was found among religious texts, but it speaks in the voice of storage, secrecy, and recovery. It suggests that someone near the end of a world chose to preserve not doctrine, but coordinates. If the Copper Scroll records real treasure, then a massive cache of ancient wealth may still lie hidden beneath desert earth, lost because the key landscape has died. If it records symbolic treasure, then its code has still not been fully understood. But the coldest possibility sits between those explanations. Perhaps the scroll was made after the treasure had already been moved, not to guide ordinary searchers, but to mislead anyone outside the circle. A book made of metal does not forget, but it can still refuse to tell the truth clearly. The Herculaneum Papyri. In 1752, beneath the volcanic ruins of Herculaneum, workers tunneling through hardened ash uncovered something that looked less like a library than a room full of burnt wood. The objects were black, twisted, and brittle, shaped like small logs pulled from a dead fire. At first, some were thrown away. Others were broken open by accident. Only later did scholars realize the impossible truth. These were not pieces of charcoal, they were books. Hundreds of ancient papyrus scrolls, carbonized by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 CE, had survived nearly 1,700 years inside a buried Roman villa. The discovery became one of the most extraordinary literary finds in history. The villa, now known as the Villa of the Papyri, had once belonged to an elite Roman household, possibly connected to the family of Julius Caesar's father-in-law. Inside its rooms were statues, mosaics, bronze works, and a library unlike anything else preserved from the ancient world. Unlike later medieval copies, these scrolls were original ancient texts, physically present in the Roman world before the empire changed, before Christianity reshaped Europe, before countless libraries burned, rotted, or vanished. But survival came with a curse. The same volcanic heat that preserved the scrolls also turned them into fragile cylinders of carbon. Their pages fused together. Their ink, also carbon-based, became almost indistinguishable from the blackened papyrus. Early attempts to open them were disastrous. Some scrolls shattered, some were sliced apart. Some yielded small fragments of Greek philosophical writing, but at a terrible cost. Every physical attempt to read them risked destroying the very knowledge it tried to recover. What makes the Herculaneum Papyri so haunting is not simply that they are difficult to read, it is that they may contain lost works from the ancient world that no one has seen for 2,000 years. The readable fragments have mostly pointed toward Epicurean philosophy, especially texts linked to Philodemus. But that may be only a narrow, visible layer. The unopened scrolls could contain lost histories, plays, scientific works, poems, political writings, or philosophical arguments believed erased forever. Somewhere inside those black cylinders may be the voice of an author whose name survived only in quotations, or perhaps whose name vanished completely. For centuries, the scrolls sat at the edge of possibility. Scholars knew they were books. They knew words were inside. But the technology to reach those words without destroying the scrolls did not exist. Then modern imaging began to change the terms of the mystery. X-ray scanning, virtual unwrapping, and machine learning opened a new path. Instead of forcing the scrolls apart, researchers began mapping their internal layers digitally, searching for tiny surface changes that might reveal ink. Recent breakthroughs have shown that some hidden texts can indeed be recovered. For the first time, the sealed library has begun to speak again. Yet this progress has not ended the mystery. It has made the silence larger. If a few lines can be recovered from a scroll, once thought unreadable, then what remains inside the rest? How much of ancient thought is still trapped in black coils, visible to machines but not yet understood by human eyes? Each recovered word proves that the library is not empty. Each unread section becomes more painful because it may contain something real. There is no need to invent a secret organization to explain why the Herculaneum Papyri remained hidden. Nature buried them. Fire sealed them. Fragility guarded them better than any vault. But the effect is almost the same. A complete ancient library survived, and for centuries humanity could stand inches away from it without entering. If these scrolls contain only familiar philosophy, they are still priceless. But if they preserve works lost from every other archive, then the history of literature, science, and thought may still be incomplete, not because the evidence was destroyed, but because it is waiting in plain sight, blackened, silent, and rolled shut. The most unsettling part is that the door is finally opening, and no one knows what voice will come through first. The Archimedes Palimpsest. In 1906, inside the library of the Metochion of the Holy Sepulchre in Constantinople, a Danish scholar named Johann Ludwig Heiberg opened a damaged prayer book and noticed something that should not have been there. Beneath the visible religious text, hidden under centuries of scraping, overwriting, stains, and decay, faint Greek letters appeared in the background. They were not prayers, they were mathematical arguments. Diagrams could be seen under the surface like ghosts beneath skin. Heiberg understood enough to realize the impossible. A medieval prayer book was concealing lost works of Archimedes, one of the greatest mathematical minds of the ancient world. The object became known as the Archimedes Palimpsest. A palimpsest is a reused manuscript, created when older writing is scraped or washed from parchment, so the material can be used again. In the 13th century, a scribe took pages from older Greek scientific texts, erased them as best as possible, folded them differently, and wrote Christian liturgical prayers over them. To the scribe, this may have been practical. Parchment was expensive. Old texts could become raw material. But beneath that practical act, an entire layer of ancient science was buried. What had been erased was not ordinary mathematics. The hidden text included parts of Archimedes' method of mechanical theorems, where he explained how he used mechanical reasoning to explore mathematical truths before proving them geometrically. It also preserved material related to the stomachion, a puzzle involving combinatorics, and sections of on-floating bodies in Greek. These were not just copies of known ideas. Some parts survived nowhere else in the original Greek tradition. The prayer book was carrying a lost intellectual chamber from antiquity. But for centuries, no one looking at the surface could see it. The physical condition of the manuscript made the recovery even harder. The pages were damaged by mold, fire, handling, and age. Some had been covered by later forged religious paintings, likely added to increase the manuscript's value when it entered the art market. These images were beautiful on the surface, but destructive to the hidden text beneath. Ironically, a fake sacred image helped bury real ancient knowledge even deeper. The manuscript became not only a palimpsest of writing, but a palimpsest of motives: devotion, reuse, neglect, profit, scholarship, and loss layered on top of one another. After Heiberg studied the manuscript, the world should have protected it immediately. Instead, its path became uncertain. The book disappeared from scholarly access for decades, passing through private hands and suffering further deterioration. By the late 20th century, it was damaged, fragile, and partly unreadable. When it resurfaced and was sold at auction in 1998, the manuscript became the subject of legal dispute, scientific rescue, and intense conservation. Only through multispectral imaging, ultraviolet light, X-ray techniques, and digital processing could researchers begin separating the overwritten prayers from the erased mathematics beneath. There was no single villain in this story. That makes it colder. The Archimedes Palimpsest was not destroyed by an army or hidden by a secret order. It was nearly lost through ordinary human decisions. A scribe needed parchment. A collector wanted value. Institutions lost track. Time did the rest. Knowledge did not always vanish in flames. Sometimes it vanished because someone decided an old book could be scraped clean. The recovered pages changed the way scholars understood Archimedes. They revealed not only results, but methods of thinking. They showed a mind approaching infinity, balance, area, volume, and proof with a sophistication that feels startlingly modern. If these pages had remained buried forever, a part of the history of mathematics would still be missing. And if one prayer book concealed this much, how many other reused manuscripts are still hiding, erased worlds beneath acceptable words? The Archimedes Palimpsest proves that lost knowledge does not always die. Sometimes it survives in a damaged body, written under another voice, waiting for light strong enough to separate the living text from the layer that tried to replace it. The Codex Borgia. In the 16th century, somewhere in central Mexico, a painted book survived the collapse of one world and entered the hands of another that did not fully understand what it was holding. It was not written in alphabetic sentences. It did not explain itself like a European chronicle. Its pages were made from folded deerskin, coated with a white plaster surface, then painted with gods, animals, temples, knives, stars, skulls, flames, serpents, and human figures arranged in scenes of ritual precision. By the time the manuscript reached Europe, its original readers were gone. Its priestly context had been shattered, and its meaning had become a locked system of images. Today it is known as the Codex Borgia, one of the most important surviving ritual books from pre-Columbian Mesoamerica. But importance is not the same as understanding. The Codex Borgia belongs to a group of manuscripts often associated with Central Mexican divination, calendars, and religious knowledge. It contains 76 painted pages, each dense with symbols that appear beautiful at first and disturbing upon closer study. The colors are vivid. Red bodies bend under divine pressure. Black-faced gods hold ritual tools. Serpents coil around cosmic signs. Human hearts, bones, night creatures, suns, and directional markers appear in combinations that seem less like illustration and more like calculation. The book does not tell a story in the usual sense. It organizes time. At the center of its mystery is the Tonala model, a divinatory calendar based on a 260-day cycle. This was not a calendar for counting ordinary days alone. It was a sacred structure used to interpret fate, choose ritual moments, diagnose spiritual danger, and understand the influence of gods on human life. Each day carried a force. Each combination of number, sign, direction, and deity created meaning. To those trained in the system, the Codex may have functioned like an instrument. To modern eyes, it looks like a storm of gods speaking in images. The problem is that the key was not preserved intact. After the Spanish conquest, many indigenous books were destroyed, especially those associated with native religion and divination. Priests and officials often viewed them as dangerous objects, not because they were unreadable, but because they were readable to the wrong people. A book that could guide rituals, preserve sacred cycles, and maintain a worldview outside Christian control represented more than art. It represented continuity. The Codex Borgia survived, but it survived without the full community of specialists who once knew how to use it. Modern scholars have decoded parts of its structure. They can identify many gods, calendar signs, directional patterns, and ritual sequences. They can compare it with related manuscripts and with later colonial descriptions of Nahua religion, yet the book still resists complete explanation. Some scenes remain fiercely debated. One page may represent Venus, death, sacrifice, drought, royal power, or a ritual transition between cosmic zones. Another may show a journey through the underworld, a sequence of temple ceremonies, or a map of divine influence across time. The images are precise, but precision without the original instruction becomes a maze. What makes the Codex Borgia especially haunting is that it was not meant to be mysterious. It was meant to be understood by trained readers. Its obscurity is the result of rupture. The manuscript became strange because the world that explained it was attacked, converted, fragmented, and partially silenced. No secret agency needed to hide its meaning afterward. History had already done the work. The book remained visible, preserved in European collections, studied under glass, reproduced in color, and still separated from the living system that once made it clear. If the Codex Borgia is only a ritual calendar, it is already extraordinary. But if it is also a guide to a complete philosophy of time, body, sacrifice, weather, fate, and cosmic balance, then modern interpretation may still be touching only the outer surface. The book may not simply show what ancient people believed. It may show how they navigated reality, choosing actions according to forces they believed moved through every day. The unsettling question is not why the Codex Borgia is hard to read. The question is what was lost when the last people who could read it fully were no longer allowed to teach what the images meant. The Dresden Codex. In 1739, inside the Royal Library of Dresden, Germany, a strange folded manuscript entered European custody with no living author, no complete origin story, and no surviving priest to explain how it was meant to be used. It had arrived from the Americas through the hands of collectors, missionaries, and colonial officials, far from the tropical cities where its symbols had first been painted. To European scholars, it looked like a beautiful relic from a defeated civilization. To the Maya world, it may have once been something far more powerful, a working book of time. The Dresden Codex is one of the oldest surviving books from the Americas. It is made from bark paper, coated with a smooth white surface and folded like an accordion. Across its pages are painted columns of hieroglyphs, gods, numbers, animals, ritual scenes, and astronomical tables. Unlike an ordinary manuscript, it does not move through history as a simple story. It calculates, it predicts. It aligns cycles of the moon, Venus, eclipses, ceremonies, and divine forces into a single system. The book does not merely describe the sky. It appears to measure how the sky moves through human life. Its most famous section is the Venus Table. The Maya tracked the planet Venus with extraordinary precision, recording its appearances as morning star and evening star across repeating cycles. The numbers inside the Codex show a deep awareness that Venus returns to similar positions after long intervals, especially through a cycle of 584 days. This was not casual stargazing. It required generations of observation, correction, and mathematical discipline. Venus was not only a bright object in the sky. In Maya cosmology, it was tied to omens, warfare, rulership, and ritual timing. To misread Venus was not just an astronomical error. It could mean acting on the wrong day under the wrong force. The Codex also contains lunar tables used to predict possible eclipses. These calculations demonstrate that Maya astronomer priests were watching the sky with patience across decades, perhaps centuries, refining patterns without telescopes, metal observatories, or mechanical clocks. Their instruments were the horizon, the calendar, memory, mathematics, and a cultural system that treated time as sacred architecture. Every date carried weight. Every cycle returned with consequence. But the Dresden Codex is mysterious because so much around it was destroyed. During the Spanish conquest and colonization, many Maya books were burned by missionaries who considered them dangerous to Christian conversion. One of the most infamous accounts comes from Bishop Diego de Landa, who described the destruction of indigenous books because they were believed to contain superstition and lies. To the people who made them, those books were memory, law, astronomy, ritual, and identity. When the libraries burned, the living instruction manuals for interpreting books like the Dresden Codex burned with them. The manuscript itself survived, but not untouched. During World War II, the Dresden Library suffered heavy damage, and the Codex was exposed to water, staining, and deterioration. Some pages were harmed, some details became harder to read. The book had already survived conquest, displacement, misclassification, and centuries of distance from its original culture. Then modern war nearly damaged it again. Few manuscripts have carried so much knowledge through so many layers of destruction. Modern scholars can read much more of the Dresden Codex than earlier generations could. They can identify astronomical tables, calendar structures, gods, rituals, and numerical sequences. Yet, full understanding remains incomplete. The technical calculation can be studied, but the lived meaning behind each ritual image is harder to recover. What did each date demand from a priest? What fear did an eclipse create? What political decision might have depended on a Venus appearance? A table can survive while the world that used it disappears. If the Dresden Codex is only an astronomical book, it is already one of humanity's great intellectual achievements. But if it was also a ritual engine, a guide for aligning rulers, wars, offerings, and time itself with celestial cycles, then modern readers may still be seeing only the surface. The Maya did not simply count days. They built a universe where days spoke back. And the most haunting question remains: how many other Maya books once explained the rest of this system before the flames turned an entire science of time into ash? The Picatrix. In the 13th century, inside the intellectual crossroads of medieval Spain, translators working under the patronage of Alfonso X of Castile encountered an Arabic text that seemed to belong to more than one world at once. It was philosophical, mathematical, astrological, magical, and deeply unsettling. In Arabic, it was known as Gayat al-Hakam, the goal of the wise. In Latin Europe, it became known by a stranger name, the Picatrix. To some readers, it was a manual of astral magic. To others, it was a dangerous book of planetary influence, ritual timing, talismans, perfumes, stones, animal parts, divine names, and invisible forces. It did not merely ask what the stars meant. It asked whether the powers of the stars could be drawn down and used. The Picatrix is not mysterious because its language is unreadable. It has been translated, copied, studied, and quoted for centuries. Its deeper mystery lies in its purpose. The book presents the universe as a living system of correspondences. Planets influence metals, colors, animals, plants, body parts, emotions, illnesses, cities, rulers, and destinies. A ritual performed at the right hour, under the correct planetary condition, with the correct symbol and material, was believed to attract a specific celestial force into a physical object. That object, usually a talisman, could then act as a bridge between the human world and the hidden architecture of the cosmos. To modern science, this sounds like superstition. But to medieval and late antique thinkers, the idea was not absurd. Astrology, medicine, mineralogy, mathematics, and theology were often connected. The heavens were not seen as distant decoration. They were understood as active, structured, and meaningful. The Picatrix gathered that worldview into one of the most elaborate occult systems ever transmitted into Europe. Its pages describe how to select moments according to planetary positions, how to engrave images on metal, how to prepare incense and offerings, and how to call upon forces linked to Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, the Sun, Venus, Mercury, and the Moon. What unsettles scholars is the book's layered origin. The Arabic text appears to have drawn from older Greek, Egyptian, Persian, Indian, Hermetic, and Middle Eastern traditions. It is not one voice. It is a compressed archive of many vanished intellectual streams. Some passages sound philosophical, discussing the nature of spirit and matter. Others read like laboratory notes. Others become ritual instructions, so strange that later, European readers treated the book with fear. The Picatrix seemed to preserve a chain of knowledge that had passed through civilizations, changing names, languages, and religious frames each time it moved. Its influence spread quietly through Renaissance Europe. Thinkers interested in natural magic, astrology, and hidden correspondences knew of it. But it also carried danger. Books that claimed to manipulate unseen forces could attract suspicion from theologians and authorities. The Picatrix was copied, but not always openly. It moved through selective circles, private libraries, and learned occult networks. It was not erased from history, but it was pushed toward the edge of acceptable knowledge, where serious scholarship and forbidden practice blur. That edge is what makes the book difficult to fully explain. Was the Picatrix a magical manual, a philosophical encyclopedia, a survival of ancient star religion, or a misunderstood attempt to map psychological and natural effects through symbolic systems? Its rituals may not work in the literal sense its authors believed, yet the book reveals something real about human ambition, the desire to make the universe answer back. If the Picatrix is only superstition, then it remains one of the most sophisticated monuments to symbolic thought ever written. But if it preserves fragments of a lost science of timing, perception, ritual, and environmental influence, then modern readers may be dismissing a language of nature they no longer know how to test. The final question is not whether the stars obeyed the Picatrix. The colder question is why so many brilliant minds believed the book contained a method for reaching them. A conclusion. These books reveal a disturbing pattern. They are not simply old manuscripts, rare codices, or damaged scrolls sitting quietly in protected libraries. Each one carries the same deeper wound, a break between knowledge and memory. Some cannot be read because their language is lost. Some can be read, but not fully understood. Some were burned, scraped, buried, reused, stolen, or removed from the cultures that once knew how to interpret them. The result is not just mystery, it is historical amnesia. The Voynich Manuscript refuses every codebreaker. The Rohonc Codex stands between scripture and deception. The Book of Soyga turns language into a locked celestial machine. The Codex Gigas binds faith and fear inside one enormous body. The Ripley Scrolls hide transformation beneath symbols. The Liber Linteus survives only because it was wrapped around the dead. The Copper Scroll records treasure that may never be found. The Herculaneum Papyri hold an ancient library sealed by fire. The Archimedes Palimpsest proves that genius can be erased and still bleed through. The Codex Borgia and the Dresden Codex show what happens when entire systems of time are broken. The Picatrix reminds us that some books were written not just to explain reality, but to interact with it. The greatest loss may not be the missing pages. It may be the missing readers. A book becomes mysterious when the civilization that understood it is silenced, conquered, scattered, or forgotten. Perhaps these manuscripts are not impossible to explain because they are empty. Perhaps they remain unexplained because the keys were taken from us long ago. The question is not whether these books contain secrets. The question is how much of human knowledge still survives in plain sight, waiting for a language we no longer remember.